So thank you so much to join this day with all of you. I'm so impressed. More than 150 people looking from all over the world to this moment. Dinesh Buju, you gave such a wonderful and warm opening address at the beginning. I was really touched. So thank you very much for having me joining you for this very moment. As you all know, I'm a biologist. And I think quite often, and when we deal with human dimensions, some biological basic knowledge would be valuable to judge vulnerability of people in mountains. So this is what I'm going to do today. And I'm well aware that many of you come from very different disciplines. Some biologists, some from anthropology, some social science people, and I cannot expect everybody has the very basic ideas about the biology of mountains. So let me remind you that we are in biogeography stratifying the mountains into different layers, and we give names to these layers like the montane belt, which is mainly the mountain forests, or what humans converted it to. This finds a limit at the tree line, which is a global phenomenon. Around a 6-degree seasonal mean isotherm, all trees stop growing. It doesn't matter whether it's Patagonia, the Rocky Mountains, the Alps, or the mountains of Nepal, which I fortunately had the chance to visit several times. I remember very strongly when I was moving up to treeline with Mohan Dev Kota many years ago in the Langtang Valley. Then we have above the tree line where trees cannot grow, the alpine, and finally the naval zone. And it was Alexander of Humboldt who for the first time made us aware that these mountains are connecting the world. There's only one biome, only one type of vegetation that goes from pole to pole, crossing the equator. You see the red ribbon here, which is connecting the alpine life zone across the world. And I placed Kathmandu just to make a point where we are, where you are now. The hosts are placed in that global naturama, as Humboldt called it. Now, we need to start by defining what mountains are. And you know, this is almost a philosophical issue. And there are no good or no bad definitions. There are simply different definitions. And whatever definition we are applying, we should at least know what we are doing, what we are using. So you could start from appreciating that much of the human population, probably half of all people, it had been mentioned before, I said 3.5 billion people depend in some way or the other in mountains. So you could include the entire catchment from the highest peaks to where the rivers enter the ocean as belonging to the mountain system. That's one way of looking at the world. Another way would be looking at the roughness of the landscape. We call it ruggedness. And there are various ruggedness measures that one could consider belonging to mountains or not. And people have, for instance, thought that taking a 38-kilometer large area, and if anywhere in that area there's a 300-meter elevation shift, we call this a mountain. If you adopt that concept, you end up with a quarter of the world, or even more, belonging to the mountains. Another way would be constraining this to a 7-square-kilometer area, so an area of about 2.5 kilometers. And then if one point is higher than another point by 200 meters, we call this a mountain. And then you end up with 12.5. The big difference is that in the last definition, we include the mountains proper, which is including Kathmandu, as far as I know, the mountains around, or the city of Davos, or city of La Paz. If we stretch the meaning to the hills, the foothills of mountains, we enter a lot of tropical and subtropical land area, banana hills, including in the mountains. There's nothing wrong or good. You just need to know when we talk about mountains and we use the wider definition, we don't talk about the snowy mountains and the hardship in steep land, but we talk about banana growers. And you can look at this from a statistical point of view. And most people are confused by these different definitions. That's why I felt this is a good opportunity to talk about them. Again, there's nothing good or bad, they're just different. And if you adopt the more stringent mountain concept, which the Global Mountain Biodiversity Assessment, who I chaired for 20 years, adopted, you end up with the green line. If you take the unit type of definition, you can see where the difference comes. It comes from people living, maybe you can see my cursor here, from 300 meters above sea level in the frost-free tropics. There, this is where the difference emerges. It's hardly different if you move really to the proper mountains. So it's simply a matter of being aware of these differences, where they are created. Let me show you how this would affect the mountain statistics where people are living. This is a table that shows you, that table shows you in which elevational belt people are living. And you can see this 500 million of people that is hosted by this 12.6% global land area, which we call the mountains proper. Then you can see that half of these people are living in, I called it banana hills, which is really the 300 to 400 meter low hill country in the frost-free tropical environment. And if you go to the warm, still montane levels, tea plantations in Nepal perhaps, or in India, then we have another 100 million, 110 million people. And as we move up the mountain, populations are thinning. These are just statistical errors. Nobody is living in the naval zone. This is just because the GIS application in steep mountains includes some villages which are actually down the hill, included into a mountain. So again, there's nothing wrong or bad. You just need to be aware that if we consider 500 million of people living in the mountains, half of that number is people who actually live in areas that many people wouldn't consider mountains. But again, it's a matter of definition. But whatever definition we use, half of mankind is indirectly teleconnected to mountains and is influenced by what's happening up there. To make a long story short, I used that slide to illustrate why mountains host more species of plants and animals that one would expect by the area they cover. And the very reason is captured by this picture, showing that topographic diversity, you may call it geodiversity, offers a multitude of microhabitats at a very small scale. So you may have a desert-like condition here on this rock, where plants adopt physiological mechanisms to survive, like in hot desert. You may have a water flow going down there with plants who like it wet, and everything in between. And so while the mountains, the alpine part of the mountains above the tree line is only 2.6% of the globe outside Antarctica, this alpine flora hosts 4% of the global biodiversity. Quite remarkable. The reason is geodiversity. Just to give you an example, we have a research station in the Swiss Alps, and if you draw a line of 1 kilometer around that station, which is 350 meters above the tree line, this is truly high up in the mountains where most people think they have nothing up there. We found 2,100 species that have a scientific name. I'm not talking about those who haven't gotten a name, all these creatures in the soil. So mountains are truly hotspots of biodiversity. And with this infrared camera image, I want to give you a feeling how diverse the life conditions are in high mountains. You see a real picture on the left and an infrared image there. And you see blue, very cold spots, and orange, on the red, very hot ones. I can tell you on that very slope, the seasonal mean temperature, the seasonal mean, not just a single hour, the seasonal mean from the first day of snow disappearance to the last day of the season varies by 10 degrees across the slope. So on that single slope, you have a difference of life conditions of 10 degrees. That corresponds to 2,000 meters in elevation. And so you have to view a 2-degree warming that we discuss in IPCC in the context of the thermal habitat diversity that is already there. It's enormous. So if you were a spider sitting in a warm spot on this slope and you feel it's getting too warm, how far would you have to go to evacuate yourself from a 2-degree warmer world. Statistically, we calculated this is about 12 meters. So you can put the temperature means of that slope in such a diagram. This is the frequency distribution of temperatures. You can see the temperatures here, the seasonal mean temperatures, and this is the frequency distribution. And you can see that some habitats are in the 5-degree and some close to 14-degree area. And you can then put on that single diagram a 2-degree warmer world. And then you would see you're hardly losing anything, the very coldest ones, which occur at higher elevation, but you're actually gaining new habitats. So in a transition period, we even see a rise in biodiversity. So from that, I distilled a cartoon, which I think is an important diagram, and I showed it many times. Some of you may have seen it. These are the different options organisms have. This includes butterflies, birds, plants, bears, whatever animal you are. If you are placed at position 1, this is the bad place, because for evacuating yourself from a warmer world, you would have to go thousands of kilometers to get away from that heat. If you are at position 2, you may have a chance to find an empty space upslope. 3 is a dangerous area in some tropical mountains which have a fog layer that protects, for instance, amphibia and epiphytes. If that fog layer shrinks, well, this is very bad. And if the mountains are not high enough, which is 5, you go to sky. But Nepal and Switzerland, fortunately, have very big mountains. So you can move upslope if it gets too warm, which is what most people think is happening under point 4. But I believe 6 is the most important. You just go around the corner to find a cooler place. So nowhere else can you escape a changing climate over a shorter distance than in mountains. And that's why I believe mountains always were refugia. And that's why I believe mountains are not particularly vulnerable in terms of biological inventory, but they're actually a very safe place because of that close proximity of extremely different life conditions. However, many of these plants occupy microhabitats at the edges of which we can see how they sensitively may change to a climatic change. So they are perfectly suited to monitor environmental changes. But I don't think biodiversity as such in the wild is endangered. It's rather a safe place to be. I would think the mountains are actually the safest place to be in a climate change condition. Now, when we consider human vulnerability, we need to remind ourselves there's a huge landscape upslope where people do not live. People live down in the valleys, in protected areas, but everything that happens upslope is affecting the people downslope. We call these teleconnection. And so it is important that we understand what stabilizes the soils up above the tree line, which is actually the roots of that diverse alpine plants, and then the montane forest and the tree line. Let me show you a single slide, the next one, to make a short answer to why there is a tree line. It is in fact that trees are coupled to the free atmosphere and are cold, while the surrounding vegetation profits from solar heat. That is the physical reason why trees cannot grow where small stature plants can grow. All these small stature plants, they engineer their microenvironment, which is much warmer, actually as warm as at low elevation on a sunny day. So that's the reason why trees are hit first. They didn't underwent a lousy evolution. They just, by their stature, they feel the cool first. I had the privilege to work in China for a couple of years. We are still cooperating on trying to explain what is it that causes the upper limit of trees. And I give you this example of an oak tree, believe it or not, that a species that grows in 4,280 meters to tree size of 4 to 5 meters and stems like this. And the simple answer is, you need to know single hours over a period of hundreds of years that were critically low to kill the tree. You cannot take today's numbers. You need to go back in history. And as you can see, these trees experienced single hours over 3 years, and we went back 65 hours by scaling those data, minus 24.1 degree. And if you measure the freezing resistance, they can tolerate this. They have a leeway, but the leeway gets very small when you go to the time of flushing. And these trees flush exactly when the last dangerous day is over on a statistical mean over 65 years. So when the minus 3 degree freezing is passed, they know by a photoperiod controlled flushing, now we can go. And the monsoon regime permits them to complete their development in the remaining season. The question is, are these trees carbon limited? I can make a long story very short and can tell you no. Carbon limitation is a story that came from tomato growers in greenhouses. In the wild, plants need nutrients to make a body and not just carbon alone. We had a huge experiment where we fumigated with CO2 mature forest trees of 40 meter size for several years. And you can see the green and the white line, they go up and down, but there was no stimulation of growth of any of these trees. This is a long story I could give an evening long lecture about, but believe me, trees are not carbon limited in the current world. Forests are not carbon limited. It's always the most limiting resource which limits growth, and that is not carbon. And we need to understand the meristems rather than the photosynthesis, because the meristems determine how much carbon can be built into the body of a tree. And these meristems are controlled by water availability, by nutrient availability, and by temperature. And if they can use carbon, they call it up from photosynthesis for investment. If they can't invest, they won't call on any photosynthetic products. It's an entire shift of paradigm that we have to do in our mind to move away from a photosynthesis-driven to a growth-driven world. Who wants to know more? I have this paper in Current Opinion. So the carbon cycle is driven by the nutrient cycle. That's a very short story, and we need to understand the nutrient cycle to explain the carbon cycle. So many people confuse, even today, a growing tree with a stocking tree. That is deadly wrong. That is if you privately confuse your money flow with your capital. A lot of money can flow through a bank account and you have no capital, or you have a huge capital and no flow. But permanently we get, even from prominent journals and prominent people, confronted with the idea that if trees for whatever reason would grow faster, they are storing more carbon. That ignores the basic understanding that it is a matter of tree longevity. I published this in Science, whether a forest is storing carbon or not. It's not a matter of how fast carbon flows through the forest, and growth is just part of the carbon flow. So I've seen these wonderful landscapes in Nepal. And when it comes to climatic change or a change of the monsoon regime, for instance, it's those human structures and the humans tied to them who are vulnerable. And it's highly unlikely the forest you see in the back. So it is people that are vulnerable in the mountains, and not so much the nature, as long as people care for those upslope vulnerable ecosystems. So it's humans that may be vulnerable to global change in mountains and not nature, as long as humans care for the upflow ecosystems. And I tried to give you some ideas what you need to know to do that. And biodiversity exerts a huge insurance against ecosystem failure. Think of erosion control and stability of slopes above your village. And under climate change, high mountains are a safe place for wild organisms. I believe this is why we have so many refugia in high mountains. So we need to protect these mountains for the sake of human well-being. I thank you very much for attending this presentation, which I also gave on behalf of the Global Mountain Biodiversity Assessment, GMBA. Some of you may have heard, and we were present with this program in Kathmandu at several instances. Thank you very much all for joining this lecture.